Good morning.
Morning. How are you doing today?
It's a sunny day.
Yeah.
Got my hat on. So, hip hip
mean,
hooray.
Does that mean it's haircut day?
No, that just means I haven't done my hair yet. I had a longer workout this morning, and probably a later night than I aimed for. So yeah, I just thought I'd just stick a hat on and then sort of birds nest stuff out afterwards.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah. So I think we should sort of come out in the open and say that you don't have any advertising relationship with Boss, unfortunately. They're not paying you a fee to wear the hat and all that sort of stuff.
It's just the only hat that I wear. Yeah, there's no affiliation with them at all.
Okay, cool. So we were sort of shooting some messages around the other day, and the subject of fear came up. And I think that's a really good subject for us to talk about, because it's something that I've got a lot of personal experience of, and it's something that I see a lot as being a driver of, let's say, the negative or the less constructive behaviors in the workplace. And I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a great topic to talk about, and experienced it a lot on the sort of business end when I've consulted and worked within businesses, and also seen it a lot in my own personal life as well. So I can relate. So I've sort of had to deal with that a lot, and still deal with it, I guess, on a daily basis. So yeah, I'm up for that.
Yeah, good. Well, I think this is one of the things. I think we all have to deal with fear on a daily basis, but actually, because most people never actually stop to think about how to deal with fear. What they end up doing is creating coping strategies almost at a subconscious level that end up driving the way they behave in those fearful moments. And a lot of the time, those coping mechanisms actually aren't very constructive. On a my personal experience of fear was I only realized quite late on in life that I had been driven by fear from a very, very early age. And it was things like the fear of failure, particularly failing at school. I think we've talked about this in some of the other chats that we've had. Fear of failing at school, not getting good results, and the consequences of, what that would mean in terms of being judged by parents and, teachers and other sort of influential people in life. Fear of being rejected by friends, and all that sort of stuff. And there's lots and lots of different types of fear. What about you? I mean, you talk a lot about your basketball days when you were a professional. Did you have fear in those days?
I don't know. I think there was it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because I don't know whether I'd label it fear, an outright sort of fear. I didn't go into games scared. Or fearful. Actually, I found that the kind of fear that triggered, it brought the best out of me, actually, and it helped me sort of rise to the occasion of who I was up against. And I liked to play against the best people that were out there. So I think I wouldn't label that as fear, but I think it runs parallel in many ways and does have similar feelings. It's just what you do with that energy. I didn't sort of sit there going, I'm not coming out of the changing room, guys, because I'm scared. It just forced me to come out of myself and try and raise my game. But I think when you look at fear, I think it's very, very few people do that naturally with fear that's going on in other aspects of their life, whether that's work or personal life. I don't think people have that. I think the nature of basketball, because it's a game, there is this kind of psychology where you have to come out and raise your game.
Right.
And I would sort of chase down the best players, or chase down the biggest players, the players that were bigger than me, to try and exert my authority on a game. I don't think we approach life in the same way.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I can remember back to my sporting days. I was a goalkeeper, and I wasn't bad. I was never going to make it professionally. I was, at 5'10", I was never really tall enough. Although I have to say, in the days when I used to play, there were pro goalkeepers who were like under 6 foot, in what was the first division in those days. But of course, nowadays, if you're going to be a goalkeeper, you got to be at least 6'2" and have the strength and agility of a gymnast. But I can always remember I did used to get fearful before games. I can remember particularly big games. And it wasn't so much I was fearful of the other team. I can remember, and it's sort of welling up a little bit in me now as I start to talk about it. It was a fear in myself that in the moment I might let myself down. I might drop the ball, as a goalkeeper.
Make a bad decision
or go out to try and catch and drop, and present an easy goal to the opposition. Not that I did that much. I actually wasn't a bad keeper, as I say, at the level I played at. But there was always, I don't know what you want to call it, that sort of inner, those words, the way your brain speaks to you that undermines that confidence. And very often, especially if it was a game where I was heavily involved, the fear would go quickly because I'm involved, I'm doing stuff, and you get that feedback that actually you're okay, you're doing good stuff. And then that sort of in the moment feedback that you get, you then become more and more confident. But it's like in those moments before, when you're projecting into the future what might go wrong, that I used to find those feelings of fear coming up within me. And of course, now that I've spent time thinking about this, I can now see when that happens in my professional life, which it does sometimes. So have you got examples of when you've been working with businesses where you've seen fear in action within a business that you've been working in?
I think the most common one I've seen is fear of making decisions, particularly people that are sort of, middle management and below. Just fear of making a decision, and goes back to what you're saying about your goalkeeping, making a bad decision, and the repercussions of that. So that I think that's probably the most obvious and frequent example of fear that I've seen with any business. You'll always find that there's a scenario or a circumstance that happens within a business, where someone isn't sure, and they have that. For me, it's always two things. It's that fear of failure and fear of the unknown. And if they're confronted with one of those two fears, they look for guidance, look for help. And of course, that then creates a frustration with, people who are looking for accountability or autonomy and all that sort of stuff. At the sort of higher level of management. But for me, that was always a tell on the culture of the business. And people were scared of slipping up or tripping over.
Absolutely.
So
I can relate to that because I worked in the business, and I was quite senior. I sort of was like commercial director, advertising director, that sort of thing. And so there was a need to be innovative, keep coming up with new ideas. But the board, the CEO, who like ruled with an iron fist, had set this rule up for all ideas that didn't originate at board level. Okay. So if an idea originated at board level, there was a different set of criteria by which it was judged, rather than if it came from further down the line. I was like about a layer of management down, maybe two from board level. Full board. It was a big company. It was like 4,000 employees. So, it was a big company. And this rule for underneath the board, it was called PODO, profit on day one, which meant if you came up with an idea, if you couldn't demonstrate that it would be profitable on day one, then it wouldn't be sanctioned. Well, who's going to, how many ideas were squashed and never even put forward? Because of that. Because the reality is, it takes a bit of time for a new idea to get for you to work out how to implement it well, and B, for it to actually get embedded and
gain momentum.
And gain momentum. So it was a complete squash on creativity and courage and encouraging people to bring out their ideas and be open. And I think that's the absolute worst example that I had of fear being imbued into the culture of the business. It was an incredible thing, really.
Yeah, because I've always, I mean, when businesses have sort of asked how to get past that, I've always said that the company values should get you through that.
Yeah.
And the culture.
Yeah.
So as long as you're making decisions that don't conflict with your values as an organization, then you're not making the wrong decision. So that you're always going to encounter times when you don't know the answer and you don't know what's going to happen. And those are the times that you fall back on the values and let the values guide you through those scenarios. But of course, if the values aren't clear, or the culture is, one that you've just described, then people are going to climb up and say, well, actually, I can't do that then. I'm just going to bin it, or I'm just going to, pass the buck, or whatever.
Yeah.
But that, that values, the values that sit behind any culture should be like a decision-making framework that you fall back on in times of need when you haven't got the answers. Yeah, in my opinion, and that's the best opportunity for businesses.
Oh, it's huge. Yeah, the best description I ever heard of values is that your values should be what guide people when no one else is looking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and I think that sort of speaks into what you were saying.
Well, but I think the interesting thing with that is your values do guide you when no one else is looking. It's just whether those values are lined up with the business's values.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Very true. And I think there's something else around this idea of fear of making decisions, and there's lots of other fears which I think we need to try and talk about in this as well. But the fear of making decisions does come from the top down, and I sort of understand it in a way. I mean, in any business you need controls, and you need to make sure that people aren't making decisions that are going to cost the business, like in an uncontrolled way. So it would be naive to sort of say there shouldn't be controls. But at the same time, if you create a situation where people don't feel safe to make mistakes, then they won't take the risks. And when people aren't taking the risks, then the business literally falls from the bottom up, because this is one of the reasons I love shows like Undercover Boss and things like that, where the bosses go onto the front line, because
that's right. Yeah, see the real.
That's where the coal face is. It's all great to be sat in your oak panel boardroom thinking you're really doing it, but it's whoever's down on the coal face speaking to the customer when they first have that interaction with your business, that the real trouble can happen.
One of the things I find interesting with that program is if you as a boss can go undercover, you've already got a problem.
Do you know, that's brilliant. I'd never thought about it from that point. Mind you, having said that, that is why in the American version they make them wear a disguise.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
That's different.
Yeah. So no, but some of them get found out. So I think you're absolutely right. If you could go into your business and people not recognize you, you're absolutely right. There's a problem there. Yeah. But that principle of really sort of understanding that it's so in a hotel business, for example, I shudder to use this phrase, but I can't think of a better way of putting it at this point. Your lowest point of contact with your customer base are the cleaners that go into the rooms. And so if they haven't been trained properly, if they haven't been given the permission to make decisions in their realm of authority, like, I don't know, let's say there's a plug missing from a bath, or something like that. If they don't have the authority to replace that plug because it's a cost to the business and they've got to go up the line to a manager, then that bathroom is going to be at a lower level of standard than the hotel wants until that decision chain is gone through,
and it's the speed of decision making then, isn't it?
And you can say, well, that's a banal example, but how many times have you gone into a hotel, and this has happened to me quite a few times, and there's been something not quite right. You know, it's not like, you know, you've gone in and the room has been horrible, you know, like really bad, but there's just like a few things that aren't quite right because the staff that go in to set the room up for the next purple haven't either been trained properly or got that level of autonomy to make a small decision that would just make things right.
Exactly. No, yeah, that's exactly the issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that, as you said earlier, that's one type of fear.
Mm-hmm.
What's another sort of common type of fear that people experience?
Well, this is something that I've put a lot of time into researching, and depending on where you look for your information, there's lots and lots of different fears. And I think as we're sort of moving in this direction, I think what we should do is clarify the difference between the type of fear that we're talking about and what also is a type of fear, which is the phobias.
Yeah, we're not talking about arachnophobia here and fear of spiders.
Or the fear of heights or things like that.
Yeah, do you know there's a fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of your mouth? I can't remember what phobia it is, but that was the single reason why I switched off from psychology at college. Went, really?
Yeah.
Can't take this seriously anymore.
Yeah. I get that. But I suppose, you know, there's 7 billion people on this planet. So, you know,
everything.
You only need a small number of people who've got that fear. And, you know, it's sort of worth studying, isn't it? And I know there's lots and lots of different phobias. But here's the thing that I discovered through the research that I did. We're actually only born with 2, and I think recently they've added a third, natural fears. And they've done this by doing experiments, ethical experiments with babies.
Yeah.
And the 2 ones that were most current were the fear of loud noises and the fear of heights.
Yeah.
And the way they discovered this, particularly the fear of heights, they put a baby on a table with a thick glass cover, and they cut up a hole in the table. So when they were crawling, they get to the bit they could see through, and they could see there's a drop, and they would stop. And this was an instinctive thing. Obviously, you know, there was nothing they'd had no education around this. So this was an instinctive thing, that the fear of falling. So I think it's the fear of falling is more accurate way of talking about it than the fear of heights.
Yeah, it's interesting though, isn't it? Because I guess it's whichever way you look at it, that one. Because is that fear of falling, or is that just actually taking care of yourself? You know, because you're not going to go and walk off a bridge, are you?
Well, the thing is,
you're not scared of heights.
Where does it come from?
Well, where does it come from? Yeah. I get that. I think it's an interesting one to come back to maybe another time. Yeah.
And then the one they've just added as one of the now 3 core fears is they now think that the fear of snakes is an inherent human fear, and that comes from our long distant ancestry, evolutionary ancestry, when, you know, we were ape-like creatures living in trees, and we literally were the food of snakes, a bit like a lot of monkeys, you know, living in the jungle now are potentially food for snakes. So evolutionarily, it became of value for us to fear snakes, and they now believe that is inbuilt into us, you know, from the minute we're born. So those are the only 3 key core fears that we're born with. And what that means is every other fear that we have, we've learned. We've learned through experience. So I was talking earlier about my fear of failure, my fear of rejection. I must have learned that from somewhere, you know, and this is true for everyone else. If you fear heights, you've learned that from somewhere. If you fear spiders, it's because somewhere in your early childhood, you were probably in the presence of somebody who feared spiders, and you saw their reaction, and you learned that spiders were dangerous, you know.
I know exactly where my fear of spiders came from, actually.
Yeah.
You're
happy to share that?
Yeah, because it's interesting now, because my better half is also scared of spiders, more scared of spiders than me, so I then have to step up
Mm.
And obviously my son is as well. Not
Yeah.
scared, but just I'm the one who's tasked with dealing with spiders.
Yeah.
But when I was a kid, probably I don't know, 7 or 8, something like that,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
We had this, don't ask me why, this strange school project where we had to get a spider, put him in a matchbox, and bring him into class.
Right.
And that was our homework.
Yeah.
And I found a spider,
Yeah.
put it in the matchbox. So at that
Yeah.
point, I wasn't scared of spiders because I
Right.
picked the spider up and put it in the matchbox.
Mm.
When I opened the matchbox to show everyone in class, the spider ran out of the matchbox and straight up my arm.
Right.
And like behind my neck. And I
Yeah.
couldn't get it off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And ever since then, I was scared of spiders.
Yeah. So there was an experience there
that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. But up until that point, I was able to handle them,
Yeah.
pick them up, put them in, whatever. So
Yeah.
it's just interesting. I remember that clearly. And that was
Yeah.
the turning point where I suddenly didn't want to touch a spider.
Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting because I think that's what that I think illustrates is exactly where all our fears come from. So, we get our first job, we have a meeting with our new boss, and in the early days, it's all nice and we all feel great. And then somewhere down the line, something happens. Maybe the boss has got out of bed on the wrong side. Maybe they had a row with their other half before they came out, or it's a hangover from the night before. And you go in and in an all innocent way, you got something to tell them, and bang, they snap at you.
Yep.
In that moment, you learn to be fearful of your boss.
Mm-hmm.
And people, when I have these sorts of conversations with people, they go, "Oh, don't be so ridiculous." It's like, and I'd never, it would take much more than that for me to become fearful of my boss.
Yeah.
And then I just say, okay, so how often do you go in with new ideas to your boss?
Yeah.
How often do you actually open up to your boss about what's scaring you about, or what you're worried about with your career, or what you're worried about with a client? And then it's like, okay, yeah, well, maybe, it's like, this is such a, this for me, this is the big thing. And it sort of relates to what you were saying earlier. So coming back to your question, how many different fears are there? So the ones that I've identified and as fears in the context that we're talking about are things like fear of failure.
Yep.
Paradoxically, the fear of success.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people don't understand that, but they all think, I want to be successful. But very often there's a limit, and people will reach their limit. And then because they're fearful of the next step, it might be, okay, yeah, I'm happy being a team leader of 5 people. Yeah, I'm happy being a team leader of 10 people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm okay about leading a department of 30 people. But yeah, we'd like to promote you to managing director. It's a team of 500 people. And suddenly that becomes, oh my God, now obviously a lot of people can do it, but there's a lot of people who step back at that point as well.
Yeah.
So that sort of fear of success, but also the fear of what's allied to this is the fear of corruption. So a lot of times money comes into success.
Yeah.
And again, this is a paradoxical fear for many people, but actually a lot of people are fearful of having a lot of money because they're worried it will corrupt them. There's that old idea from the Bible, it's easier for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than to get into heaven. The love of money is evil. All these words around money get imbued into us at an early age, and it leads to this idea of fear of corruption, or one of the things that, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say what they all lead to is self-limiting beliefs.
Yeah,
that's what they all lead to.
Yeah. So other big ones, and this that really show up in the workplace, is the fear of rejection. So this is particularly true for people who are self-employed, running their own business, who have to go out and drive their own sales. So the fear of being rejected stops them from going out and really making sales calls and or going to networking meetings and all that sort of stuff. So one of the most common things I hear is people saying how they hate going networking.
Yeah.
You know, and one of the reasons is if you don't know how to, if you haven't got the skills, if you haven't learned how to be a good networker, then you can have that experience of being rejected, you know.
Yeah.
But it's for me, it's like all these things, there are skills that can be learned to overcome them. What other fears come to your mind?
I think there's fear of embarrassment as well.
Absolutely.
I think there's a difference between that and failure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can try something and fail, and that's reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the fear of embarrassment is a different type of fear.
Yeah.
Often causes, I mean, a lot of these things often cause procrastination as well. And that's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
People hold off on making decisions, or they hold back on committing to things, or acting in many circumstances.
Yeah.
And then often it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy anyway, doesn't it?
It always does.
Yeah. You know, there's a saying, I can't remember word for word, but it's something about the only guaranteed way of failure is to not try or not do anything. Is to do nothing, and that's a truism in lots of these fears that cause blockages. So embarrassment is one, and that manifests in lots of different ways, and you often get there's a degree of that when people are scared to pick up the phone and make a sales call, scared to get up in front and talk talk about people. That whole public speaking piece is a fear as well.
Absolutely.
And that can be a real challenge for people, and it's integral and can cause a ceiling to occur in their chosen career path.
Well, that's the fear of being judged. You know, that's and you know, I think I saw I've seen this referred to many times, but I don't think I've ever actually seen the original research, but lots of people quote some like piece of research that appears to be out there saying the fear of public speaking is a bigger fear in most people's minds than the fear of dying.
Really?
Yeah. And I've seen that referred to loads of times, but I've never actually seen the actual research that backs it up. But yeah, it's all around the fear of being judged. And that's, as you say, it stops people putting themselves out there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these things, I think we haven't touched on that. A lot of these things tap into, you know, if you sort of apply like the 5 whys to some of these fears, you'll find a lot of them tap into like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it can be traced all the way back down to just, I don't want to lose my job, be without shelter. You know, it drives all the way down, and that's that connection between our needs and how we fulfill those needs through work. And it's a real fear, and you know, when people who don't have those fears are kind of can be quite flippant about them, you know, and unsupportive in the workplace, and a lot of those fears do link back quite seriously to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and therefore
could I just contend with you on that point?
Yeah, sure.
See, what I would say is those people who don't have the empathy with those who do show those fears, I would say they're not the ones who don't have the fears. I think they're the ones who are blocking the fears. They do have them, but they emotionally don't have the maturity to be able to admit that within themselves. So when they see it in other people, they ignore it, they squash it, they belittle them for having those fears. Oh, what are you worried about? You know, just get on with it. You know, they've got no ability to empathize with the challenge that person is feeling in overcoming whatever challenge. So I would actually contend with you that the people who show up like that do actually have the fear, but don't actually have the emotional intelligence to be able to deal with it. And that means they can't emotionally deal with the people who do have that fear. And that's been my experience of working with people. So sorry to contradict you on that.
No, I just think it's a mix, personally. I know that, you know, I'm thinking about public speaking, you know, as an example. I know people that are very good at public speaking and then can't sort of relate to people who struggle with it. And that's a challenge for them. And so I think it's a mix. I totally get what you're saying, and I think people do shy away from that you know, because it's like holding up a mirror, isn't it?
Yeah.
At the end of the day. And I think that, you know, and I think what people have developed, and we touched on it earlier, was coping strategies. Rather than actually tackling the root cause. They just have a coping strategy.
Yeah.
You know, that whole kind of adage about, you know, just visualize the whole audience naked. It's a coping strategy. It's not it's not a mechanism for dealing with fear. It's just a coping.
Well, it doesn't help you develop your skill of public speaking, does it? I mean,
it doesn't, no.
For me, the root to all of these things is seeing through the fear to what is it telling me about a skill I need to develop within myself. Because okay, this is why we need to separate from the idea of phobias to the fears that we're talking about. And so for public speaking, this is something that I went through. I invested heavily in learning how to become a better public speaker, and that's given me the confidence to stand up and speak in public to a much greater degree than I ever had before. Am I the world's greatest public speaker? No, but because I've got the skills of, or I've got much better skills of doing it now, the fears that I used to have around public speaking have pretty much gone, you know, because I know how to put a public presentation together in a way that is sort of going to be okay, you know. And I think this applies. And did you ever read that book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway?
No, I've not read that. I'm familiar with it, but I've not read it.
So by Susan Jeffers. And really what I think there's a line, I think this is her line. What she says is, everything that you want lies on the other side of your fears. Yeah. So that relates to the point you were making, that your fears create limiting beliefs, they create barriers, etc. So, you know, the whole point of her book is to bring those fears out into the open, acknowledge them as fears, and then think, okay, well, what's the lessons I've got to learn about coming through these, you know, fears, and then taking a big deep breath and going for it. If you
and that's the thing, isn't it? Is if you want to. So, you know, I might have a fear of skydiving. Do I want to overcome that fear? I don't know. How does it serve me? I don't know. And so I think one of the things that we sort of touched on earlier when you asked about my basketball, there's a difference, because you would see players that were scared. And for me, it was always about, and you've hit the nail on the head, it's developing the skills. I would develop skills and develop the attributes of my game that would match or beat anyone that I was put up against. And so my approach to doing that and developing myself was different to people. It's not so different now, because obviously lots of, you know, like you said, people are bigger and they're more athletic. But when I was watching the game, I would watch the smaller players and see what attributes they had. And so I presented a problem for people that were big, because I was more athletic, quick, could handle the ball. And then if they put someone smaller on me to keep up with that aspect of my game, I would just shoot over the top of them. And so I had that, but I developed that intentionally. And so you do get, you know, that's the difference between developing your skills and actually going in and saying, I want to thrive in this. Versus I want to cope. And you would see players that just wanted to sort of get through the game and almost be invisible. And just get through it. I think the same's in work. You know, you get people that will say, right, I've got a coping mechanism for public speaking, because I just want to get through this. I don't want to be doing this.
Well, I think you see that a lot. Not, you know, okay, we've been talking about public speaking, but I think you just see it in the day-to-day of coming, you know, people coming in and they just want to do their job, keep their head down, you know, do whatever they're given to do, get through that. And the biggest fear they have in the day is that something comes up that they have to then go and approach their boss about, and ask the boss a question, because they're revealing in that moment that there's something they can't do. That creates a fear. Oh my God, if I say I can't do this, then I'm putting myself at risk. You know, they're going to think they've got to get someone else in to do my job. And And what I've seen happen a lot, and be interesting to know whether you have, is what this causes is people not to actually bring up important things that are going on at the coalface or at the lower levels in the business that the senior managers, the leaders need to know about.
Yeah.
But because those people are like fearful that if they reveal something that they're not aware of, that they're incapable of handling.
Yeah, shoot the messenger, isn't it?
Yeah, that they're going to lose their job. So
yeah.
And it then becomes, the problem magnifies and magnifies and magnifies until it becomes something that lands on the boss's desk as a big problem.
Yeah.
And it all stems at the beginning from a lack of understanding about the fear at the lower end in the business.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit about, the sort of fears that can show up. We've talked a bit about why it can happen. If you're a leader of a business, or you're, a leader in a business as an employee, you've got a team or whatever that you're leading, what would be your tips on how to recognize fears within yourself, first of all, but also secondly, how to recognize when, say, someone in your team might be showing the symptoms of fearful thinking?
Yeah, for me, I think it's self-reflection, and if you're looking at fears that you're making, and 5 whys is an easy way of doing that. Just asking why you're making certain decisions. I think you've got to, and this might sound a bit woo-woo, but you've got to kind of tune into your gut as well a bit and say, actually, why is this making me feel uncomfortable? Why am I not comfortable doing that, and why am I comfortable doing this? And listen to that and try and analyze it and try and understand why that's happening. You can ask for others' advice. I mean, we've both done this with business owners for a long time, but I think in order for us to be effective, the business owner's got to recognize it in themselves first.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise you're just locking horns. And so, some of that is, a lot of that is very difficult because it's looking in the mirror.
Yeah.
But I think looking at the decisions you make and understanding why you're making them, perhaps, and what the drivers are, and recognizing where some of that is coming from a place of fear, even just by listing it, and saying, these are the decisions I've made, where do I think they've come from?
Sure. And I think there's something that's just come to me in hearing you sort of describe that is, and this is a fear that I didn't mention earlier, and I don't think we've talked about, is the fear of making things worse.
Yeah.
So, the other side of that coin is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, something can be sort of ticking along. It's not like really broken, but it's also not really going along as it could be. It's like a car that's firing on 3 cylinders instead of 4 or something, because one of the spark plugs isn't working. But this idea of fear of making things worse, I actually think is very, very common. And it's certainly why a lot of people in leadership positions, where they've got a challenge with somebody in their team, they won't confront that challenge because they haven't got the skills to have that conversation in a constructive way that will lead to an outcome that it works for both the team member and themselves. It's the skill of being able to have a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
And most people in management leadership positions, in my experience, do not have that skill.
No.
So in fear of making the situation work, they back away from confronting it.
Yeah.
So that was just something that come to me as
absolutely right. Absolutely.
As you were speaking. So you've got this as a leader, you've asked yourself this question, you've got a bit more experience now of acknowledging your own fears. What would you say is the best way? You see somebody in your team who you generally believe is a good person, they've got good skills, but you see them being fearful, not perhaps showing up in as confident a way as you think they could do. What are some things you could do to help them?
Well, that's where you reach out to those people and help them with their own development. So that's twofold. That's partially skills based, which is, you know, in the personal development side, which we've talked about before, the difference. But it's both of those things. You know, I know a company that set training budgets for their people, but let their people pick what they invested their training in.
Mm-hmm.
And one of their people, you know, was in his 40s, and he chose swimming lessons. And it was to develop his overall confidence, because he'd always felt lacking confidence because he knew he was a 40-year-old man who couldn't swim.
Mm-hmm.
And the company spent his training budget on swimming lessons, knowing that it would help.
That's cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it was a digital agency in Bristol, and so I think you've got to reach out to those people and recognise them and support them, and that's one side of that coin. The other side is work hard at creating a safe environment.
Yeah.
That they're working within, because if the environment isn't safe, it doesn't matter how much investment you make in their training and their development, they're not going to feel comfortable making those decisions because of repercussions.
Yeah.
So you've got to try and create a safe environment, and that takes time, and that, you know, that looks at culture, looks at values, and looks at who you've got around people.
Yeah.
And that's not, there's no overnight fix to any of that.
Yeah.
But you've got to start somewhere.
Can I just offer a bit of a counterpoint to that? Sorry, I feel like I'm taking the counterpoint to you a lot in this conversation, but it's just because this is such an important subject for me, simply because of my journey through fear. And when I was a senior manager in a big company, and I had a significant team working in for me, there was a couple of occasions when I had people with potential and they were falling over. One was when I had a sales management role, and I had this guy. He sort of come from slightly outside of the mainstream sales, but it was an area he wanted to get into. He'd been involved in sales, but on a bit of a what do you call it, a lateral way.
Yeah.
And anyway, after a while, we gave him quite a bit of responsibility, but after a while, it was clear that it wasn't quite gelling. And so what I did, I thought, I genuinely tried to help this guy, genuinely tried. And so what I did, out of my own money, I bought a book on sales techniques. And in a conversation with him, I said, look, you know, I've just thought this might be helpful for you. And he was completely offended. It absolutely destroyed his trust in me and belief in me. And ultimately, he ended up transferring back to his old job. But I was genuinely trying to help him. I could see what the challenge was that he was going through. And that was definitely a case where my lack of skill in being able to navigate through that challenge of how he perceived himself caused it to backfire. And then I had another similar situation at a company a bit later, where I was working with I was a little bit more senior. So I was working with a little bit more senior manager and trying to coach them, and bumped into the same problem where I was a little, I was, how can I put it, unskilled in the way in which I approach this. So what I would say is, learning how to do this and developing it as a skill, as a manager stroke leader, is absolutely crucial if you're going to develop your people. It's not something that you can go into
and just heavy-handed.
No. And like, even if you've got the best intention, well, they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and those were two experiences that I had where that was true. It's like, develop the skill, you know, and then you overcome the fear, I think, as we were saying earlier. Cool. Is there any other aspects of fear that we haven't talked about that you think we should mention?
For me, I think that's probably touched on the most common ones that people out there are facing, or you know, experiencing, and not necessarily aware of it either a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think the point you made about almost making the connection between fear and needs. So I'm really bringing that out in the open. I think that was a really good point, because fear is so often attached to not achieving needs, or feeling that the way in which you're fulfilling your needs might actually be withdrawn from you for whatever reason.
Yeah.
You know, and that triggers fears. And of course, it's not just about the basic level of needs, like, you know, can you pay the rent? Can you get your food in? And of course, you know, as we're talking about that right now, there's literally millions of people in the UK and billions probably around the world who face that challenge because of everything that we've been through. But it also happens at higher levels as well, doesn't it? You know, it's like, you know, if you've had that sense of freedom and authority as a leader, and somebody is brought in above you, and you get that sense of freedom and authority being taken away, that will absolutely trigger your fears about what your role is, just as much as if it's around having your salary taken away, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So cool. So it's all about acknowledging fears. Having a fear is not cowardice. That's
No,
the thing
exactly.
I would say.
It's not a weakness.
No, and there's a fantastic saying that I think it was Nelson Mandela, and I think he said, "Courage is not the absence of fear; it's the ability to confront your fears with courage."
Yeah,
it was words to that effect.
Yeah,
and ever since I was introduced to that, it's really helped me to understand my own fears and take them on. So cool. I think that was really, really useful.
cool.